A scar on his arm, a medal in a drawer, a story buried for 60 years, until one question from his grandson unlocked a war story he swore he'd never tell. Asterisk, what you're about to read was buried for more than 60 years. It's not in any history book. It wasn't told in any documentary, but it lives quietly, heavily, in the soul of one old man sitting on a porch somewhere deep in the American heartland. That Saturday afternoon, the breeze was warm, and the scent of freshly cut grass lingered in the air. The white fence had been painted 2 weeks before. Like every summer, the flag flapped slowly, firmly, not proudly, but faithfully. And in the old rocking chair that had known the weight of 3 generations, he sat with his curved brim hat, his faded flannel shirt, and his hands resting on his lap like time-carved oak. His grandson, 13 years old, too curious for his own safety, sat on the porch step. A golden retriever leaned against his leg like it, too, was listening. "Grandpa, did you ever kill anyone?" The old man didn't look up. He kept rocking. Once, twice, 3 times. Then he spoke, slow and low. "A ship doesn't go down just from the holes in its hull. Sometimes it sinks from silence." The boy frowned, not understanding. He wouldn't understand what came next either, not with his mind, but with his chest, because some stories aren't meant for the head, they're meant for the soul. The old man's hand moved slowly to the arm of the chair. The sun caught a thick, jagged scar that ran from his wrist almost to his elbow, something the boy had never noticed. "This didn't happen in any workshop," he said. Silence. The dog let out a long breath, like it somehow knew what was coming. The old man stood slowly, walked to the screen door, opened it, went inside. 2 minutes later, he returned with a dark wooden box, placed it on his lap, opened it. Inside were 3 things: a tarnished naval medal, a faded photograph of 23 boys in uniform, all smiling, and a worn Bible with one corner burned and softened by age. "I never showed this to anyone. Not your grandma, not even your father." The boy leaned in. His heart beat like he'd stumbled onto something sacred. It was February of '45. I was 19. 2 days out from base. Calm seas, to calm. He paused, swallowed. Torpedo hit us just after midnight. No light, no warning, just steel against steel. The stick in the boy's hand dropped to the ground. I don't remember the sound, just the cold. And then the silence. When the hull broke, there wasn't much screaming, just water everywhere, swallowing everything. He rolled up his sleeve. I pulled 47 out, one by one. Some didn't even know they were drowning. The boy's eyes widened. "You saved them?" "I didn't think about saving. I just didn't want to be the last one left." He looked at the medal. "They mailed that 6 months later. No letter, no name. But why didn't you ever tell?" "Because the Navy said the ship never went down. Said it wasn't supposed to be there. Said the whole thing would complicate alliances." The dog shifted in its sleep. "I buried it. The screams, the names, the salt, and now maybe. I'm tired of pretending it didn't happen." They sat quiet. The wind touched the trees. The flag flapped again. The boy stared at the Bible. "You still read it, every day. Some pages more than others." The old man closed the box, looked out toward the lawn. "There's something I never told anyone, not even the Navy." The boy's head tilted. "What is it?" No answer. Not yet. But 3 days later in the attic, the boy found a letter, and what it said would change everything he thought he knew. Not just about his grandfather, but about the country that had sent him to war and never fully brought him home. That Sunday, after church, the boy snuck into the attic while the adults talked politics and pie in the kitchen. The old boards groaned under his feet. Dust swirled in the sunlight pouring through the narrow window. He found the letter inside an old cigar box wrapped in twine. The handwriting on the envelope was shaky but deliberate. It was addressed to a name he didn't recognize. Inside, the paper crackled, folded twice, yellowed with age, but still legible. It wasn't from his grandfather. It was to him. "Whoever finds this, know the truth. They left us. We weren't lost, we were abandoned." His breath caught in his throat. There were signals, there were calls, but no response. "We floated for 2 days, 48 hours with sharks circling. We lost 4, one by one. I told them to stay calm. I told them help would come. A tear hit the page, but help didn't come until he swam 1.5 miles through currents and open water, towed a raft with a line around his chest. He did what the government wouldn't. The boy lowered the letter. Everything was quiet except for the creaking of the rafters and the distant bark of the dog outside. He read the signature. It was one of the men from the photo. There was more. Notes, names, a list, coordinates. He took the letter downstairs, heart pounding. His grandfather was asleep in the chair, the box still on his lap, as if he'd never moved. The boy sat beside him, didn't say a word, just held the letter out with both hands. The old man opened one eye, looked down, took the paper, read it. He didn't cry. He nodded once, folded the letter, put it in his shirt pocket, and then he whispered something so quietly, the boy almost missed it. It wasn't about medals, it was about men. The next morning came gray and heavy. Not the kind of gray that promises rain, the kind that settles in your chest and makes breathing feel like work. Tommy sat at the kitchen table, picking at his cereal, watching his grandfather through the window. The old man stood at the garden fence, staring at nothing, or maybe everything, the way men do when the past won't stay buried. His grandmother moved around the kitchen like a ghost herself, quiet, careful, as if one wrong step might shatter whatever fragile piece they'd built over breakfast. He didn't sleep, she said without looking up from the dishes. Tommy nodded. He hadn't either. The conversation on the porch had cracked something open, something that had been sealed tight for 60 years. And now it was bleeding through the walls of their neat, orderly life. "Grandma," Tommy said, his voice small, "did you know about the ship?" She stopped washing the same plate for the 3rd time, turned slowly. "I knew he came home different," she said. "I knew the nightmares. I knew he'd wake up sometimes, gasping, calling names I'd never heard." She dried her hands on her apron. "But I also knew not to ask. Why? Because some wounds heal better in the dark, Tommy. And some stories take a lifetime to find their voice." Outside, his grandfather was walking toward the barn, slow, heavy, like a man carrying more than his own weight. "He's going to the workshop," his grandmother said. "He always goes there when the memories get too loud." Tommy stood up. "Can I give him time, sweetheart? This isn't easy for him." But Tommy was already at the door. The barn smelled like motor oil and sawdust. And something else. Something Tommy couldn't name, but felt in his bones. Sadness, maybe. Or secrets. His grandfather sat on an overturned crate, holding something small in his hands. Tommy couldn't see what it was from the doorway. "Grandpa," the old man looked up. His eyes were red. "Come here, son." Tommy walked over, sat on another crate, waited. In his grandfather's hands was a compass, old, tarnished, the kind sailors used before GPS and satellites made navigation easy. This belonged to the ship's navigator, his grandfather said. Kid named Peter Mitchell, 17 years old, lied about his age to enlist. He handed the compass to Tommy. It felt heavier than it should have when the torpedo hit. Peter was in the navigation room. Chart table went over on him, pinned his legs. Tommy's fingers traced the compass face. I got him out, carried him to the deck. But his legs, they were crushed bad. Did he make it? His grandfather was quiet for a long time. He made it to the water, made it to the makeshift raft we cobbled together from debris. Made it through the first night. He paused, but the second night, infection set in. He was burning up with fever, talking about his mother, about the girl he was going to marry when he got home. Tommy felt something cold settle in his stomach. He gave me this compass, said, "Get the others home, Jimmy. Promise me you'll get them home." Tears were running down the old man's cheeks now. He died just before dawn. I held his hand, felt it go slack, and then I had to let him go. You had to let him go into the water, son. We couldn't keep him with us. Not in that heat, not with the sharks. Tommy set the compass down with shaking hands. That's why you never talked about it. Because of Peter. Because of Peter. Because of the 26 who didn't make it off the ship. Because every time someone calls me a hero, I think about the ones I couldn't save." They sat in silence, the compass between them like a bridge across 60 years of grief. "Grandpa," Tommy said finally, "how many did you pull out of the water?" 47. "And how many lived?" "All of them, every last one." "Then you kept your promise, you got them home." His grandfather looked at him, really looked at him. "You think that's enough, I think," Tommy said, his voice steadier than he felt, that Peter would think so. That afternoon, his grandfather did something he hadn't done in decades. He drove to town. Not to the feed store or the hardware shop, not to the clinic or the bank. To the library. Tommy went with him, sat beside him at the old computer terminal while his grandfather hunted and pecked at the keyboard with 2 fingers. They were looking for names, the names from the photograph, the names his grandfather had carried for 60 years. Some were easy to find: obituaries, wedding announcements, high school reunions. Others had vanished into the American sprawl of suburbs and strip malls and second chances. But a few were still there. Robert Bobby Kowalski, retired steelworker, Chicago. Frank Morrison, insurance agent, Portland. Daniel Santos, high school principal, Phoenix. Samuel Chen, restaurant owner, San Francisco, for men, still alive, still breathing, still carrying the memory of a night in February 1945 when a 19-year-old sailor wouldn't let them drown. "What are you going to do?" Tommy asked as they drove home. His grandfather gripped the steering wheel tighter. "I don't know," he said. "For 60 years, I've lived with ghosts. Maybe it's time to talk to the living." The first letter was the hardest. His grandfather sat at the kitchen table for 3 hours, writing and rewriting the same 2 paragraphs. "Dear Bobby, you probably don't remember me. My name is James Matthews. I was a seaman aboard the USS Criterion in February 1945. If you are the same Robert Kowalski who was pulled from the Pacific Ocean on the night of February 23rd, I would very much like to hear from you. There are things I need to say, things I should have said 60 years ago. If this letter finds you, and if you remember, please write back. Your shipmate." Jimmy sealed it, addressed it, put a stamp on it, and then he set it on the counter and stared at it like it might explode. What if he doesn't remember? He asked Tommy. What if he does? That night, his grandfather mailed for letters. And then they waited. The response came faster than either of them expected. 2 weeks. A Tuesday morning in late September, the mailman knocked on the door instead of just leaving the mail in the box. "Got something special for you, Jim," he said, handing over a thick envelope. "Looks important." The return address said, "R. Kowalski, Chicago." His grandfather's hands were shaking as he opened it. Inside was a letter, 5 pages, handwritten in careful script, and a photograph. A group of men in their 70s and 80s, standing around a dinner table, all of them wearing Navy veteran caps, all of them smiling. At the bottom of the photo, someone had written, "The Criterion Survivors Annual Reunion, Chicago 2019. His grandfather sat down hard in his chair. "They've been meeting," he whispered, "all these years. They've been meeting." Tommy read over his shoulder, "Dear Jimmy, remember you? Son, we've been looking for you for 78 years. Every February 23rd, we gather. Those of us who are left, we tell stories. We remember the ones who didn't make it home. And we toast the sailor who saved our lives. We never knew your last name, never knew where you were from. The Navy records were sealed. But we never forgot. How could we forget the kid who swam through shark-infested water to pull us onto that raft? Who shared his water ration when we were dying of thirst? Who sang hymns to keep our spirits up while we waited for rescue? Jimmy, you've been the guest of honor at every reunion for 78 years. The empty chair at the head of the table, the toast we make to the unknown hero. Please come to Chicago. Please let us see you again. Please let us say thank you. Your grateful shipmate, Bobip S." Enclosed are letters from the others, Frank, Danny, Sam. "We're all still here. We're all still grateful. And we're all still waiting for you to come home." His grandfather folded the letter carefully, set it on the table, and cried. For the first time in 60 years, James Matthews cried. Not from grief, but from relief. Because sometimes the people you save you right back. Chicago in November felt like coming home to a place he'd never been. The train pulled into Union Station at 2:47 p.m. on a Thursday. Tommy helped his grandfather down onto the platform. The old man, moving slower than usual, weighted down by more than just his travel bag. 60-8 years since he'd left that city as a 19-year-old sailor. Now he was returning as a grandfather with white hair and secrets that had finally found their voice. Bobby Kowalski was waiting at the gate, 87 years old, bent over a walker, but his eyes were sharp as the day he'd climbed onto that makeshift raft in the Pacific. The two old men looked at each other for a long moment, neither speaking, the noise of the train station fading to background whisper. Then Bobby smiled. "You son of a bitch," he said, his voice thick with Chicago and tears. "You beautiful, stubborn son of a bitch." They embraced like brothers, which, in every way that mattered, they were. The reunion was held at Bobby's grandson's restaurant on the South Side. Nothing fancy, just good food and better memories. They came from across the country, old men in their 80s and 90s, some with walkers, some with oxygen tanks, all with stories they'd carried for 7 decades. Frank Morrison from Portland, still tall, still strong, still the joker he'd been at 19. Daniel Santos from Phoenix, retired principal, quiet dignity wrapped around a core of steel. Samuel Chen from San Francisco, restaurant owner, grandfather of 12, survivor of more than just the war. And Eddie Walsh from Boston, the baby of the group at 91, still called kid by the others, 5 men, plus James, the last of the 47. The others had passed over the years, heart attacks, cancer, the slow erosion of time, but these six had made it, had survived the war, the peace, the decades of ordinary living that somehow felt more miraculous than the 4 minutes of chaos that had brought them together. They sat around a table in the back room, pizza and beer, nothing elaborate, because the food wasn't the point was memory. The point was finally being able to say thank you. "You know what I remember most," Frank said, his voice soft despite his laughter lines. "It wasn't the torpedo, wasn't the water, it was you singing." James looked up from his barely touched beer. "Singing, in the raft, 3rd night. We were all half dead, thirsty, scared, and you started singing hymns. Amazing grace. How great thou art, that voice of yours, it kept us sane." "I remember that too," Samuel said. "My grandmother used to sing those same songs when I was little. Hearing them in the middle of the Pacific, it felt like family." Daniel nodded. "You told us stories too, about Iowa, about your farm, about your mother's apple pie. Made us believe there was still a world waiting for us. Made us believe we were worth saving." Eddie added quietly. James shifted in his chair, uncomfortable with the praise, still carrying the weight of the ones he couldn't save. "I just did what anyone would have done." "No," Bobby said firmly. "You did what Jimmy Matthews would have done. There's a difference." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a manila folder. "We've been keeping records," he said. "All of us. What we did with the lives you saved." He opened the folder, spread photographs across the table. Frank's family, 3 sons, 8 grandchildren, a small construction company he'd built from nothing. Daniel's students, hundreds of them over 40 years, teachers, doctors, lawyers, lives shaped by a man who understood what it meant to be given a second chance. Samuel's restaurant, a gathering place for 3 generations of Chinese immigrants, a cornerstone of his community. Eddie's machine shop, employing 40 men for 50 years, building engines, repairing dreams, keeping the world running. Bobby's union work, fighting for the rights of steelworkers, protecting the men who built America's backbone. 47 lives, Bobby said. But look what came from those lives. The children, the grandchildren, the businesses, the students, the communities. He pulled out a calculator, started adding numbers. We figure it conservatively, just counting direct descendants and people whose lives we touch professionally. You saved 47 people that night, but those 47 people, they've been responsible for touching, teaching, helping, employing, or raising over 1,200 others. James stared at the photographs, at the faces of people he'd never met, but had somehow helped bring into the world. 1,200 people, Samuel said, living their lives because you wouldn't let us drown. And that's just us, Frank added, the 5 sitting here. We lost track of some of the others over the years, but every one of them, everyone had a story like ours. James picked up one of the photographs, a young girl, maybe 8 years old, smiling gap-toothed smile at a birthday party. Who's this? My great-granddaughter, Eddie said. Lucy, she wants to be a nurse when she grows up. Says she wants to help people like her great-grandfather helped people. James touched the photo gently. She exists because you pulled me out of the water 78 years ago, Eddie continued. She exists because you wouldn't give up, because you kept swimming when any sane person would have quit. The weight of it hit James like a wave, not just the 47 men he'd saved, but the universe that had rippled out from that one act of courage. Thousands of lives, tens of thousands, all because a 19-year-old boy from Iowa had decided that letting good men die wasn't an option. I need some air, James said. Standing up suddenly, Tommy followed him outside. The alley behind the restaurant was quiet, urban quiet, the kind filled with distant traffic and nearby dreams. James leaned against a brick wall, breathing hard. You okay, Grandpa? I spent 78 years thinking I failed them, James said. Thinking about the 26 who didn't make it. Thinking about Peter Mitchell, about all the ways I could have done better. He looked up at the Chicago skyline, lights beginning to twinkle in the gathering dusk. But I never thought about all this, about what came after. Tommy stood beside him, 13 years old, but wise enough to know when silence was the right response. You know what the hardest part was? James continued. It wasn't the water, wasn't the sharks, wasn't even watching Peter die. He paused. It was coming home and pretending it never happened. Watching other veterans get welcomed back as heroes, while I had to act like I'd spent the war fixing engines in a safe harbor. But you were a hero. Heroes get parades, Tommy. Heroes get medals. Heroes get to tell their stories. Maybe, Tommy said carefully. Heroes are just people who do the right thing, even when nobody's watching, even when nobody will ever know. James looked at his grandson, really looked at him. When did you get so smart? I had a good teacher. They stood in comfortable silence for a few minutes, the weight of 78 years slowly lifting. Are you ready to go backin'? Tommy asked. James straightened his shoulders, adjusted his tie, looked once more at the city lights. Yeah, he said, I think I am. When they returned to the restaurant, the other men were waiting with something. None of them had expected. A medal, not an official one. Not from the Navy or the government or any institution that mattered to bureaucrats. This one was handmade, crafted by Samuel's youngest son, who was a jeweler in San Francisco. Bronze, simple, elegant. On one side, the outline of a ship, on the other, February 23, 1945, USS Criterion. 47 lives saved. Hero of the Pacific. We had it made 20 years ago, Bobby explained. Been carrying it around at every reunion, hoping someday we'd find you to give it to. He placed it in James's hands. This is from us, from the 47, from our children and grandchildren, from everyone whose life is better because you refused to let us die. James held the medal up to the light. It was heavier than it looked. There's one more thing, Frank said. He pulled out his phone, showed James the screen. It was a video call. On the screen, a woman in her 90s, sitting in what looked like a nursing home. But her eyes were bright, alert. Jimmy, she said, her voice scratchy but strong. Jimmy Matthews. Yes, ma'am, James replied, confused. My name is Helen Mitchell. Peter was my little brother. James's knees nearly buckled. Peter talked about you in his letters home, she continued. Said you were the finest man he'd ever known. Said if anything happened to him, I should find you and tell you that he considered it an honor to serve alongside you. Tears were streaming down James's face now. Ma'am, I should have saved him. I should have done more. Son, Helen said gently. Peter died knowing that 47 good men would live. Because of what you did. He died believing his life had meaning. That's all any of us can ask. For, she paused. And I've spent 78 years proud to be the sister of a hero's best friend. They stayed until the restaurant closed, telling stories, sharing memories, filling in the gaps that 7 decades had created. When it was time to leave, they exchanged addresses, made plans for next year's reunion, promised to stay in touch. You know what the best part is? Bobby said as they waited for taxis outside. What's that? We don't have to toast an empty chair anymore. They said their goodbyes, hugs that lasted longer than necessary, handshakes that carried the weight of lifetimes. As the taxi pulled away from the curb, James watched his shipmates disappear into the Chicago night. 5 old men, walking slowly, but walking proud, walking home. 6 months later, James Matthews sat on his porch again. Same chair, same dog, though the golden retriever was grayer now, moving slower but still faithful. Same flag flapping in the Iowa breeze. But everything else had changed. The wooden box wasn't hidden anymore. It sat open on the small table between the rocking chairs, its contents no longer secret. The metal, the photographs, the Bible with its burned corner, and something new: letters. Dozens of them, from all over the country. After the Chicago reunion, word had somehow spread. Veterans organizations, military historians, families of sailors who had served on ships that never existed during the war. People started reaching out, telling their own stories of classified missions and buried heroism, of men who had been ordered to forget the very things that had defined them. James had become, without wanting to, a symbol, not of military glory or patriotic pride, but of something quieter, more important: the courage to finally speak the truth. Tommy sat on the porch steps, reading from a tablet. He was 14 now, taller, wiser, changed by the experience of watching his grandfather emerge from 78 years of silence. "There's another one," he said, scrolling through email from a woman in Oregon. "Says her uncle was on a submarine that was never supposed to be in Philippine waters. He died 2 years ago, but before he passed, he told her about a rescue operation that saved 3 villages." James nodded slowly. What's she asking for? Same thing they all ask for: help getting the story recognized, help finding the other men who were there, help breaking the silence. In the months since Chicago, they had received over 100 similar letters, stories of heroism buried by classification stamps and government secrecy. Men and women who had served with distinction, but had never been allowed to serve with recognition. "What do you want to do?" Tommy asked. James was quiet for a long moment, watching the corn sway in the distance, listening to the sound of his dog's contented breathing. "I want to help them," he said finally. "All of them." The foundation started. Small. The James Matthews Foundation for Unrecognized Military Service, funded by donations from the Chicago reunion veterans and their families, operated out of a small office above the hardware store in Cedar Falls. Its mission was simple: find the stories that had been lost, research the operations that had been classified, connect surviving veterans with each other and with their families' histories. Most importantly, create a space where these men and women could finally tell their stories without fear of prosecution or judgment. Tommy became the foundation's first researcher. His grandmother handled the correspondence, and James became something he had never wanted to be, but had always been destined for: a voice for the voiceless. But the most meaningful connection came from an unexpected place. Margaret Kowalski. She had taken Bobby's name when she married his younger brother in 1952. Reached out through the foundation's website. She was 94 years old, living in assisted care in Omaha. Bobby had told her about finding James, about the reunion, about the stories that were finally being shared. "I have something that belongs to your grandfather," she wrote in shaky handwriting, "something I've carried for 78 years. When James and Tommy drove to Omaha to meet her, she was waiting in the community room with a small wooden jewelry box on her lap. "Peter talked about you in every letter," she said, her voice still strong despite her age. "He said you were the finest man he'd ever known. Said you sang hymns to keep everyone's spirits up." She opened the box. Inside was an engagement ring. Simple, elegant, untouched by time. "He gave this to me before he shipped out," Margaret continued. asked me to wait for him. I did wait. 78 years. James's eyes filled with tears. I never married anyone else, she said simply. Not because I couldn't move on, but because Peter gave me something more valuable than a husband. He gave me purpose. She reached into the box and pulled out a folded paper. A letter, yellowed with age. This was the last thing he wrote. The night before your ship was attacked, he had a feeling. He said something was coming. She handed the letter to James with trembling fingers. My dearest Margaret, if you're reading this, then the worst has happened. But I want you to know something. I'm not afraid. There's a sailor on this ship named Jimmy Matthews. He reads his Bible every night and shares his chocolate with the boys who get homesick. If something happens to me, find him. Tell him that serving alongside him was the greatest honor of my life. And Margaret, don't mourn for me. Take the love we shared and give it to someone who needs it. Become the nurse you always dreamed of being. Save lives in memory of the life I couldn't live. I love you. Always. Peter James folded the letter carefully, his hands shaking. I became a nurse, Margaret said softly. Worked in children's hospitals for 52 years. Saved thousands of lives in Peter's memory. She reached back into the jewelry box and pulled out something else. A small, worn notebook. Every child I helped, she said. Every life I touched. I wrote their names in here. All of them exist because Peter believed in love bigger than death. She handed the notebook to James. I want you to have this, and the ring. Peter would want you to know that his sacrifice mattered, that love like ours, it doesn't end with death, it multiplies. 1 year after the Chicago reunion, they held the first annual Silent Heroes gathering in Cedar Falls. Margaret was there, in a wheelchair but radiant. She had donated Peter's engagement ring to be displayed at the foundation as a symbol of love that transcends loss. 43 veterans attended, from World War II through Afghanistan, men and women whose service had been classified, overlooked, or deliberately obscured. James spoke last, holding Peter's compass in one hand and Margaret's notebook in the other. I spent 78 years thinking I failed Peter Mitchell, he began, thinking I should have saved him, should have done more. He looked at Margaret, who smiled and nodded encouragement. But I've learned something. Peter didn't need me to save his life. He needed me to honor his sacrifice. And Margaret here, she showed me how. He held up the notebook. 3,417 names. Children whose lives Margaret saved in Peter's memory. Each one a ripple from that night in 1945. Each one proof that love doesn't die when bodies do. 5 years later, James Matthews passed away peacefully in his sleep. The funeral was held at the Cedar Falls Community Center. Margaret, now 99, spoke at the service from her wheelchair. Jimmy Matthews saved my Peter's friend, she said, her voice carrying across the packed room. But more than that, he taught us all that heroism isn't about the moment you act. It's about how you live with the consequences of that action for the rest of your life. She looked at Tommy, now a grown man carrying on his grandfather's work. Peter died believing in love bigger than death. Jimmy lived proving that belief was right. Today, the James Matthews Foundation operates out of a building in downtown Cedar Falls. Peter Mitchell's compass sits in the lobby next to Margaret's engagement ring and her notebook of saved lives. Tommy serves as director. His own children Peter James and Margaret Rose play in the office, where their great-grandfather once answered letters from forgotten heroes. The foundation has helped declassify over 40 military operations, connected more than 5,000 veterans with their service histories, facilitated hundreds of reunions between men and women who thought they were the only survivors of forgotten missions. But perhaps most importantly, it has preserved Margaret's lesson that love, once given, never dies. It multiplies through every life it touches, every story it saves, every silence it breaks. In Margaret's old room at the care facility in Omaha, which has been converted into a small memorial, visitors can read Peter's final letter and see photos of the thousands of children Margaret helped throughout her nursing career. On the wall, a simple plaque reads, "Some promises take 78 years to keep. Some love stories never end. They just find new ways to multiply." And in Cedar Falls, On quiet afternoons, when the corn is high and the flag flaps gently in the Iowa breeze, you can still feel it. The presence of ordinary people who did extraordinary things. The echo of love that refused to die with death. The sound of silence being broken, one truth at a time. Because that's what Jimmy Matthews and Margaret Kowalski and Peter Mitchell taught us. That heroism isn't just about saving lives. In a moment of crisis, it's about honoring those lives for all. The moments that follow, it's about turning grief into purpose. It's about keeping promises even when the person who made them is gone. And sometimes, if you listen carefully to the wind across the Iowa fields, you can hear it. The voices of all the heroes who are finally being heard. The stories of all the love that refused to end. The sound of promises being kept, one generation at a time. At Still Standing Souls, we believe that the most powerful stories aren't always the ones carved in stone or written in history books. Sometimes they're the ones whispered between grandfather and grandson on a quiet porch. Sometimes they're the ones carried in silence for decades before finding their voice. Sometimes they're the ones that teach us that heroism isn't about being seen. It's about seeing what needs to be done and doing it. Your family has stories too. Stories of quiet courage, stories of hidden sacrifice, stories of ordinary people who did extraordinary things when the moment demanded it. Don't let those stories disappear with the generation that lived them. Ask the questions while you still can. Listen to the answers while there's still time. Honor the heroes while they're still here to be honored. Because some silences are meant to be broken, and some stories are too important to take to the grave. Subscribe to Still Standing Souls. Because every evening, we're uncovering another story that almost disappeared. Another hero who almost remained unknown. Another truth that almost stayed buried. That your story might be next.